What isn't a protest is attempting to burn down hotels with asylum seekers in them. That is hatred, violence, and a lot of the time completely unprovoked. You cannot call that protesting.
I'm Ella.
And I'm Kieran. Welcome to Impolite Company, the podcast in which we bring our black queer perspectives to some of the most interesting and pertinent DEI issues of the moment.
Join us as we laugh, cry and go deep on what topics are exciting us, as well as what's keeping us up at night.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good. It's Sunday evening and we're about to talk about riots, so...
There's never been a better day to talk about riots than a Sunday.
Well, indeed. Indeed.
Really interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about the recent riots, the racist riots, let's just call it what it is. Disguised as... what were they disguised as? Were they disguised?
They were sort of thinly masquerading as anti-immigration protests, I suppose. But I think the veneer was very thin on that. I'm not sure that it was... You didn't have to scratch the surface much to poke holes in that. Yeah. Legitimate grievances, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, we saw widespread disruption and violence across the UK. I think a really good place to start would be kind of maybe have a bit of a discussion about how you felt during that period when those riots were happening all over the UK. And I think being in London, they were getting closer and closer, right?
Yes. So I think for context, for anyone who doesn't know, there were riots throughout this summer, I guess. I don't know how long they went on for in the end, maybe a month or so. It was definitely a few weeks, triggered again, ostensibly by 3 children being murdered at a dance class in Southport by the rumour was that it was a Muslim immigrant. It actually was not. It was a young Christian black person, but that was the sort of false claim that happened and was used as the sort of excuse. And we'll talk about that being bollocks in a second, but it was used as the excuse for violence and looting and people tearing through towns and setting things on fire, and apparently in defense of women and girls, offering no safety to women and girls, and certainly not helping the grieving families. But that was the sort of spark, in theory, that lit the match, and that led to weeks of violence against black and brown people in towns and cities across the UK. I think my reaction was a horror. Just sort of horror, multi-layered horror, really, because horror at what happened to those girls being then sort of overshadowed by something else which feels like a tragedy. I feel for the people whose families were grieving and for the community that was grieving, and then the conversation became about something else entirely. Horror that any person who is brown in the UK being, brownness always being, feels like we're stuck in this loop of that being an excuse to define a whole category or a whole community of people, whether or not it's even accurate, whether or not we're talking about the same community that, this guy came from a completely different community than the communities that were then being blamed. But that didn't seem to matter, really. It was just a good excuse to get some racism out of the locker. Then also, I think, if I'm really honest with myself, there was an element of I mean, it was just horrific watching things online, you know. I saw some videos of brown people being pulled out of cars. You know, mobs literally looking to see if the face was brown before they decided to pull someone out of a car. I mean, I sort of don't even know how to describe that kind of, the feeling of seeing that. And then the other part of it, I think, is, if I'm being honest, is living in London and being from Leeds, and both areas that have seen rioting and different type of rioting, but rioting in the past. Whilst in times where I've been either living there or is like in the not too distant past, there were some riots in Leeds in the 80s, for instance. There were the London riots in 2011, both different contexts and different types of riots. But sort of they're on your peripheral vision, you know, they're on your like periphery of your understanding. But I think I haven't experienced anything like this before. This being a racist riot, this kind of riot before. And also I think the creeping sense that it was moving towards London, and then being no sort of, I think you can kind of cushion yourself with the idea that it's not anywhere near you a little bit, you know, a sort of, I don't like that sensation because I think that it's something that we need to interrogate in ourselves. But there is a part of you that goes, okay, this is horrible, but it's over there. It's in Southport, it's in Liverpool. I was shocked it was in Liverpool, actually. But it's in these pockets of the UK that are not where I am. And you can sort of blithely comfort yourself with that. And I think as it moved towards London, there was a like, oh shit, this is happening here. This is snowballing to a place where I didn't think it would snowball to.
I think to your point around kind of looking into why the reaction was that way of kind of like, oh, it's not here, is I think partly for me was probably when I look back on it and I kind of reflect on how I felt at that time, probably like a coping mechanism, like, oh, it can't, not that it would, it's almost like a way of like, I'll deal with it. For me, it's like, I'll deal with it when it gets here. Like almost like I know it's coming, but I think like for me, I think there was an element of, well, I didn't find it that surprising, to be honest. After all of the last, like, you know, 6-7 years of whipping up all of this hatred and division, I kind of wasn't surprised. There was a part of me that was like, we kind of knew this was going to happen at some point, just needed an excuse. And that probably sounds really...
Someone just needed to light the match, you know,
Yeah, someone just needs... It's like, it's felt like this for a while, with there being so much division and people having to be on one extreme or the other. It's felt like it's like conditions are ripe for something like this to happen. I think I was very much the same as you in terms of feeling so sad for the people that are grieving those two girls that were killed in a horrific way. It now being kind of linked to this other event that's happened that really had nothing to do with it. And these things will forever be linked together. Like their children's legacy, hopefully that can be rewritten for them. But for the public consciousness, they're probably going to be very much attached, which I think is really sad and does the complete opposite to what the protesters, in inverted commas, were saying they were trying to achieve or defend. And I think I had there was a level of like willful ignorance, and then almost like a refusal to change any of my behaviors and acknowledge anything was happening. Like people reach out to me like, hope everything's okay. Like friends, like white friends reach out to me in a way that they did maybe during kind of like the Black Lives Matter protests and all that kind of stuff. But for me, it was different, right? Like I felt, I don't know, at the time it was almost like, yeah, I'm fine. I wasn't really processing what was happening. I think that happened after, and whether that was a protection mechanism or it just kind of being like, I'm not surprised, we just have to deal with it when it comes, or deal with it as it gets worse. We will have to deal with it at some point, and I need the energy to be able to deal with it if it happens psychologically, you know?
I'm trying to think. I think I was surprised. I don't, maybe shocked but not surprised would be the way to put it. I do think that there was perhaps naively an element of me that thought that kind of thing wouldn't happen again. I think there was a processing I had to do. Oh, this kind of violence, brown people being attacked in the street and their cars being set on fire and then being beaten up with, metal rods and things like that, was something that I would have placed mentally in the 1970s. Not that there's been no violence since then, but that kind of organized mob violence, I was surprised. I've had to process that that's still simmering under the surface, that 40, 50 years on, the kind of thing that my grandparents really, not even parents so much, maybe parents, but have talked about, that kind of fear, that kind of walking down the street and being surrounded by a group of white people fear is something that we have to still contend with. I think I was shocked by that.
When you look back as early, as recent as the 90s, with the hooliganism and all that kind of stuff, I think they're, when I see that kind of behavior, that's straight away what I think of. I live near QPR Stadium, and I remember as a teenager, and actually I actually reflect on this as an adult, didn't really understand the gravity of it at the time. But I remember Shepherd's Bush is a very multicultural area, very diverse, and always has been as far as I remember. But I remember when certain clubs used to come and play, there were certain fans that the police would escort into the stadiums. So they were still able to go. They're essentially hooligans that are being escorted into the stadium because the police knew that there's a high chance that they would attack the people in that area, essentially. And I remember things like that, and I'm like, that wasn't that long ago. And then just recently, I've just felt like it's been simmering, and also I think the other thing about it is as well that I was reading when I was doing research for this episode. I was reading a really interesting article from the London School of Economics, and the author of the article was talking about this idea of there being a general consciousness of these types of issues which goes against the far right narrative, and there being a better public consciousness of the things they didn't know before, BLM, for example. And is this a perfect opportunity? Is it a perfect opportunity to kind of a perfect attempt by the far right to kind of appropriate this new consciousness for their own benefit? It's two-tier policing. We're going to this is not fair. This is the way that we act, and start to conflate the two things of rioting versus protesting and all this kind of stuff. And I just wonder if there's something there.
So white people know that there's a two-tier policing system, and therefore, because they have a heightened consciousness about this, because it's been talked about by activists and black and brown communities, and then they use that to their own end in situations like this. I mean, do they not already know that, though? Surely, white people, in my experience, like to feign ignorance about there being, systemic societal racism. But when push comes to shove, they know, right? It makes me think of that Jane Elliott clip, from the 90s, where she's standing in front of an audience and she says, and it's a mostly white audience, I think, and she says, stand up if you would be happy to trade lives with a black person. And nobody stands up. And then she says, well, then exactly. Don't act like you don't know, because you act like it's the same, and you act like you don't see it, and you see it. And so I think there's something about that sort of deniability that happens. But I see what that makes sense, because it also made me think of, when you were talking about it, the phenomenon of people weaponizing therapy speak. It's like everyone goes to therapy now. And then what's happened in some senses is a lot of men, in particular, heterosexual men on the dating scene, have learned therapy speak without necessarily doing the work. But it's kind of almost then used as a manipulation tool, right? So they weaponize the idea of boundaries as a way to actually control. So they'll say, well, it's boundaries. I need you to not speak to other men or whatever. And so it's like, I don't know, it just made me think there's another kind of phenomenon of something being, the public consciousness being raised about something. And then that's ultimately, hopefully, a good thing. But there's this sort of potential weaponization of it, of like, how can an already privileged group use that to their advantage? So rather than using it to kind of, rather than actually deeping it and doing something, going like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
How can I use this to?
How can I use this? Yeah.
Further cement my dominance?
Like, how can I take this to the next level? How can I try and reverse people's consciousness? Like, how can I have a more sophisticated response to this that uses a similar mechanism? It's not even a similar mechanism. It's not even similar.
And what's interesting actually about, we talk about two-tier policing. Obviously, we're talking about race there. But, I think it's also interesting that in the wake of these riots, you've got people rightly being sent to jail for inciting racial hatred. In some cases, people, were setting fire to hotels housing asylum seekers. There's a variety of different criminal offences that people have been going to court for and being sent to jail for. The sentencing has been interesting, right? Because some people are getting years. For the most part, people are getting not a huge amount of time. When you compare that to, there were some Just Stop Oil protesters recently who, I almost still can't believe this, but under the new, I think, public order offences, which were introduced by the Conservative government and don't seem to be being stripped away by the Labour government, which is wild because they basically make it illegal to protest. Under those new offences, some Just Stop Oil protesters have been sent to jail for 4 and 5 years. And in that case, they were discussing a protest. So they were on a Zoom call, discussing plans to protest. And that was infiltrated by, I think, a Sun journalist. And they've all been given years. So now we're so freedom of speech doesn't apply to climate protesters talking about arranging a protest.
Yeah, we've got people burning down hotels with people in them.
Yeah, we've got people burning down hotels.
I think also the other thing as well, like we're dangerously blurring the lines between riots and protests. Like if you look at what happened in these protests in particular, or protests / riots, depending on they were just conflated. They were conflated. These were riots. But then when you compare people that were, that gathered at mosques and vulnerable places where to show kind of solidarity and inclusion, they tended to be non-violent and less provoked. Like that was very different. And the anti-racist kind of protests that were happening in response to what was going on and all the riots, that is a protest. What isn't a protest is attempting to burn down hotels with asylum seekers in them. That is hatred, violence, and a lot of the time completely unprovoked. You cannot call that protesting. And I think a lot of the time the media would talk about that in the fact that it's protesting and conflate the two things. So it's like this side versus this side. It's like, no. There's two very different things happening here. And it's really important to have the context. And when we're talking about policing those two different types of things.
Well, indeed, yeah. I think it's important to talk a little bit about semantics here, because there's the riot versus protest thing. there's also the framing of race riots. You know, historically, race riots are either what we're talking about, or Black communities rioting usually in response to heavy police presence in their community, excessive use of stop and search, and in some cases there's a specific trigger, again usually to do with the police. In the 1980s, the Brixton riots were kicked off because the police shot Cherry Gross, who was the mother of somebody that they were looking for, and they shot and paralyzed her. In 2011, it was the shooting of Mark Duggan. There's sometimes the police have shot or killed somebody in the Black community, and then in some cases and in most cases actually there's a backdrop of heightened tensions because there's a heavy police presence in a particular community. That tends to be what happens when we're talking about Black people, Black and brown communities rioting. And what tends to happen when we're talking about the kind of riots we're talking about in summer is actually deep racism being stirred up in the white community, and then wanton violence and lynch mobs spreading. And I take deep offense that both of those things are called race riots. So this is Sathnam Sanghera, who is an author and has written a lot about the British Empire, on Channel 4 News, talking about what the distinction is and why he thinks the distinction is important.
Sathnam, let me just begin with you. I mean, do you think we've been clear enough about what it is that is going on? You know, we've seen racial attacks described as anti-immigration protests. It seems very confused.
Yeah, I keep on hearing these disturbances being described as race riots, and the term implies that people of colour somehow have some sort of blame in causing these disturbances when they are caused entirely by white mob violence. And I know something about what it's like to be caught up in one of these so-called race riots. One of my first memories as a kid is of hiding in a Sikh temple as hordes of far-right National Front thugs try to burn down shops and homes in Wolverhampton. And history tells us that we also had so-called race riots in 1958. In 1919, they hit Cardiff and Liverpool and Glasgow and London. And each time, white mobs were attacking people of colour. And each time, there's talk of brown people being blamed, partly for just existing. And it's happening again today with this fearful talk of Asian thugs gathering in Birmingham. Let's call this what it is. These are racist riots. It's racially aggravated violence. These are lynch mobs. And at worst, it's domestic terrorism.
I think as we were listening to that, one thing that I think is true and factual is a lot of the people and places that a lot of the people that have been targeted were British citizens.
Exactly. You know, I think it's absolutely ludicrous to even entertain the idea that these anti-immigration protests, when Black and brown people are being exclusively targeted for being Black and brown, and most of the people who are therefore targeted are Black British people or Asian British people who are in many cases born here. They're not finding, you know, the Australian immigrants of Clapham and starting ten a penny down there, you know, and you know, and inciting violence against them. So, but I think
it's very, you know, it was just racism, and I think that's the thing that is really important is a fact, right? As far as I'm concerned, that is a fact. Like, you were targeting people that looked a certain way, regardless of where you felt they were coming from, whether they were asylum seekers, whether they were immigrants, whether they're people that were taking your jobs.
But do you think that we have a deep lack of literacy in this country, firstly about racism and the history of racism and the history of race? I think that that's something just generally across society, we're not taught about it, that there's active challenge when anyone tries to suggest that we should decolonize the curriculum or teach about the British Empire. That gets shut down, that gets voted down. Children here, unless they're learning it at home and not learning about our history when it comes to race and racism, and why are there black and brown people in our cities and towns, and what prompted that, and what's the history of that. And then also it feels like, so that's just societal. Sorry, I started framing this as a question and now I'm just making a statement. It's a soliloquy.
I'll just listen along.
And then you also have the lack of media literacy, right? And it feels like this is we're at the late stage of this sort of phenomenon that we've had for over a decade, it feels like now, probably longer, of this sort of both sidesism that happens in the media. You saw it in relation to Brexit. You know, you see it in relation to a lot of things now. You see it in relation to climate. It's not responsible to get people on your show, on your morning news channel, to get an anti-racist campaigner and a racist. That's not showing, you know, balance in a debate. I saw a really good clip of Afua Hirsch talking about this, and she said something like, we wouldn't get pro-child abuse campaigners and anti-child abuse campaigners talking about child abuse on TV, and no more than we should get anti-racist campaigners and then racists talking on TV and for so-called balance. You know, we should be absolutely dismissing the idea that racism is a legitimate viewpoint that we should give airtime to, and I don't think we do that.
The other thing as well is like the sensationalizing of these types of focusing on things that are very sensational. For example, you know, what was covered in terms of like the size of people attending these riots and or protests, depending on what was happening, right? Like, so let's say the people that were like gathering to defend mosques or show solidarity and anti-racism protests, and then also the cleanup that was happening after, like we never saw any of those crowds. We never saw like coverage of the good things that were coming out of this, like things that would give you a little bit more hope that not everybody is like this. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not as
I did on after when they came to London, there was, I remember distinctly because it was the day after my birthday and I had plans to go to the theatre, and this was the first time in my life really that I can ever remember speaking to family and saying, should I not go? Should I not go out? Should I not leave the house? And having like genuine, like, I'm going to get on the bus and I'm scared feelings. I don't remember ever having that. So and then it ended up being a sort of, I don't want to say a false alarm, but it ended up being that on those days where there was big far-right protests planned for London, there was a huge, and in Brighton and places like Bristol, I think maybe as well, there was a huge anti-racism presence that completely drowned out the 5 or 6, you know, racist bastards who showed up, which was very heartwarming, and I liked it a lot, and it, you know, it gave me a warmth in my heart and all of that stuff. But I also felt like I didn't know how to process the commentary around that, because I think there was also a sort of, there's this thing that we love to do in this country, which is to go, and we stood the racists down, and actually this is a good news story. You know, isn't it a good news story that actually this is what Britain is all about? And there's an element of that which I think is true, right? Like, we do outnumber them, they are loud, but it's good to see that actually, you know, in context you can see there's these 6 loud bastards who just are jonesing for a fight, and then there's thousands of anti-racist protesters who have come out to just literally drown them out. I think that is an important point to make that actually the change has happened and people do come out in force, and actually when we do organize, there are so many more of us than there are of them. And I think that's
what's really important, right? Like, there were people coming out to clear up the mess, and I think the only time I saw this type of thing was exactly the same coverage that you saw, right? Not every morning after those protests where people, volunteers or people from the community, were coming out to clear up the mess that had happened the day before. That doesn't get the coverage, right? You don't get to see that at scale because you're just focusing on what happened the night before.
But I also think that I don't want to sound cynical. I think that I love seeing that stuff, and I think it's a good reminder, because it can obviously feel deeply depressing that we're still where we are in some cases. And actually, when you do see a Scouse granny get on the news and say, fuck these racist bastards, you think, yeah, and it's wonderful. And at the same time, I think what I don't want us to do, and what there is a danger of us doing, is sort of plastering over it and going, well, actually, it wasn't a big deal because loads of people came out. And the real story is that loads of people came out to protest the hatred. That's true. But it's also true that I've never had so many friends say, how are you doing? Are you going out tonight? Like that's, I think we also have to sit with that reality that for a 24-hour period or so, if I just take my own social circle, a load of black and brown people were genuinely debating whether to leave the house.
And I think the thing it's the conversation that happens after, right? When we're reflecting on what happened and why. I read a really interesting article by Nazaria Limbada. I hope I haven't messed up her name. But she spoke to a bunch of predominantly brown people about how they felt whilst this was happening. And there was a gentleman in his early 30s that I think made a really good point. He said, what needs to happen next is a genuine grown-up conversation about racism in the national consciousness, because I understand the anger some of these people are feeling. They feel left behind after consecutive governments have left them with a lack of opportunity and economic disenfranchisement. I can't speak properly today. But they're blaming the other, and their ills are not represented by the person of colour, the immigrant, the asylum seeker. And I think that is we all came out part is really important, but also the conversation that happens now about why did this happen? How can we have a conversation that's close to the truth? And how do we have that conversation in a way that people will listen on both sides?
How do we apply the curiosity to why this happened? Because I think we love to do a thing in this country where we go, well, that happened. Okay. And moving on, why did it happen? How could something so shocking happen for such a long period of time? How did they organize so well for a brief moment before we got our own arses into gear? And what are the sort of social and political conditions that whipped this up?
Yeah, exactly. Why are the hotels full of asylum seekers? Because the government have not been processing claims for months and years. Like the very basics of it. Do you know what I mean? The funding has been taken away to ensure that it's worse than ever in terms of the processing of something. And if that's even what you're processing anyway, it's really important to have those parts of the conversation and that be a part of the narrative. There's also a question of whether that, yeah.
But also, I think that there's a thing of the political class like to whip things up and then express horror when they turn violent. If your slogan for the past however long, including fronted by a brown man, has been stop the boats, that has been your slogan, and Labour are marginally better. I mean, it's astounding that a Labour government could only be marginally better. The way that Yvette Cooper talks about migration and asylum seekers and what we have to do, and the sort of like criminal crackdown way in which it's spoken about is the product of years and years and years of this kind of rhetoric being normalized, and then us sort of pushing to the right on it, including in parties that are historically left and corners of the sort of establishment or whatever that are historically more left wing talk about this in terms that I think it's really been slowly pushed in a direction which normalizes a kind of racism, a kind of explicit racism. And, you know, I think, has it gotten worse? I don't know. But the way that Islamophobia in particular is normalized in this country is shocking.
And that's the thing. I think there's a risk of, I think especially on the Labour government that we have now, it's almost like, I feel like sometimes it's like saying the same thing, but it's like, but we're better people, so it's not as bad. It's like, no.
We'll process the claims faster. We'll do it with more competence.
Yeah, exactly. But I think also it's like, we'll do it better because we're nicer. It's like, no.
But also the way, you know, you think about the way that the Labour government talked about Rwanda, which was obviously deeply misguided, absolutely awful policy on all fronts. But they talked about it as being not economically viable. They talk about it from that perspective of it being foolhardy and the maths didn't make sense and we poured millions into something that was never going to be viable. And all of that is true. But it's interesting that that's the way we choose to talk about it.
Yes.
Not that it's absolutely morally reprehensible that we were even contemplating. And so you see the way that we choose to talk about these issues. And, you know, you said something about how people take it, you know, that the guy who they spoke to in that article and how the grievances are being misdirected. I was reading an article by David Olusoga about the riots, and I thought he said something that which I thought was really important. He said, to put the violence directed at British Muslims, Black Britons and asylum seeking down to, quote, legitimate grievances is to fall for one of the most toxic and intentionally divisive falsehoods in the populist handbook. The myth that class and race are diametrically opposed, the assertion that non-white people have no class identity. In this distorted worldview, the true working class are the white working class, and the difficulties they face are not a consequence of political choices that affect everyone, irrespective of ethnicity, skin colour or faith, but of, quote, elites putting the needs of minority communities first. And I think that the reason I thought this was such a sort of powerful quote is this kind of something we don't have time to talk about now, but we should probably talk about in a whole other episode, is this idea of class solidarity. Like when people talk about the working classes are angry, what they're talking about is the white working classes are angry. It's like Black and brown people don't have a right to identify as working class, even though for the most part they are, and that we don't talk about class solidarity because then we'd be talking about how we disrupt those established systems which we don't want to disrupt, right? And so it's working class white people being pitted really against working class Black and brown people who, by and large, actually have the same grievances.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's like it's mobilizing. It's giving the false, trying to build a false reality that the color of your skin means that you have more in relation than your either financial, economic, like where you sit in terms of class, which is just not true, right? Like nobody, there was no like riots or anything, or there was no discussion when Ukraine went to war and lots of people that were white came as refugees to the UK. People were opening their houses out like to them and their hearts. There was no, so it's that it, but it just but it just feeds into that idea that actually what's being done here is like, you know, the elite and those in power are mobilizing the working classes to work in their favor and to create this division, right? And I think that it's very clearly a division on race when you actually look at it. When you take a step back, literally nobody has the same opinion if you're coming from a country where you look like people from here.
Well, yeah. Well, brown asylum seekers and refugees are potential terrorists, and refugees from Ukraine are poor people who are from a war-torn country who can't help it, and it's just shocking to see. Which is, by the way, true, but it's shocking to see, because they're white.
I don't think they saw them as, I don't know if you mean poor as in like
No, sorry, I don't mean poor as in poverty. I just mean unfortunate.
Yeah, I think those types of people saw them as just like exactly the same. And there's a war.
Yeah, I mean poor souls. And just the way that we responded to the crisis of the war breaking out in Ukraine and the refugee crisis that ensued is exactly how we should have responded to how we should be generally responding to asylum seekers and refugees coming into the country, and they're all fleeing. And in some cases, actually, in a lot of cases, when it's black and brown refugees, they're fleeing from countries that have been destabilized by us. So in some, you could argue, could argue they have more of a claim, really. But that's a whole another thing. And then obviously the social conditions are that Britain feels like it's in the worst place it's been from a societal perspective, from an unequal perspective in a really long time.
I also think from a rational perspective, I think it just feels like people's thought processes are completely irrational. They're unable to see what's in front of them, and they're unable to. And this isn't. I don't think this represents most of our country. But when you think about going back to the Rwanda, even from an economic perspective, the fact that even if you were racist and you just didn't want people of color in the country, you're willing to bankrupt the country to do it. When you look at how much it was going to cost to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, they did some extrapolations. Yeah. And I'm sorry, we saw it at Brexit as well, right? People were I can't believe this is happening and we're such economic disaster. I'm you could have seen that was going to happen. You could see this was going to happen. Or we haven't got any people to work in hospitals. It's we never invested in creating for the last however many decades, we've not invested in making that a viable career. We knew that most of our hospital workers weren't from the UK. They were immigrants, and before that, actually, even even now, a lot of people that work in are the descendants of immigrants. How did you not see that?
There's that LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson quote: If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best coloured man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. That is in a nutshell, everything we're talking about. That's the deep emotional attachment to racism. And that's not specific to the UK. You see it in America as well. You see it with Trump. We know what Trump represents. We know what that would look like. We know it. And then people still are quite happy to sleepwalk into it because they're so emotionally attached to their racism on a deep identity level that they would rather have their pocket literally picked by Trump than imagine a world where they could be better off but coexisting in a multicultural society.
When a lot of the rioters, the media were describing the rioters, they were talking about this mindless violence. It was just suddenly overtook them, and they just suddenly were I need to just be racist and smash stuff up. And this is just a random thing that's happened. Something triggered me, and now I'm punching somebody in the face. And I think it just distracts from that it distracts and reinforces that idea of being mindless as being like is a thing, right? Like the people that went to those protests, like the claim of them being mindless is absolute rubbish. Like when they look at a lot of the history of those people leading up to that event, that thing happening, you know, they were posting problematic, inflammatory posts that were very much on message. Like it wasn't just random, and these things aren't random.
But we like to think of them as random because that exempts us from looking at the deeper causes. We also do this with misogyny. We go, how could we have predicted that this man would kill his wife and his 2 daughters? Or how could we have predicted that, you know, these are just like random incidents? Well, I think we can go, there are those evil people who set hotels on fire, and we're not one of them. So it's another way of saying not all men. You know, it's another way of going, not all white people. I'm one of the good ones. And therefore I don't have to engage with this. And I think we all have to engage with it if anything's going to change, because it's there sort of rumbling under the surface, and we are doing a terrible job of engaging with it. And I think the people who should be taking the lead on it, the media in particular, are doing a terrible job of engaging and don't have actually the range to be asking the questions they should be asking. I mean, how often do you watch I feel this more often now than ever, because I feel like I have to research these issues so much because we talk about them all the time, that you realize how much you know that the average journalist doesn't know. And so you watch in anger as they're interviewing someone, and you think, why aren't you asking this? And why aren't you challenging them on this point? And you think, you're a journalist. You're supposed to know more than I do on this. And I don't think that there's any accountability to really deeply understanding the issues. And that goes from not only how they challenge and talk to people on the show itself or on the news program or whatever, but it goes to who they have on, how they choose who they have on, how they then treat who they have on, how the producers interact with the people in their ears. It's just all of that whole systemic problem.
Yeah, I don't care. But okay, then so what's the point? What point are you making? Like, if that was the case, if it was about, okay, hold on. If this was about kids being raped, why are you not protesting against all in the places where a lot of people that have been abused by white people? Where was you turning up for that? Right? Where was you going for that? Like, where was you? Is everyone that's white a potential paedophile?
A lot of people who weaponize their hatred and say that it's in some way about protecting women, which is like the classic thing. This was what these riots were sort of predicated on, the like, we're protecting our young women, right, from violent brown people. First of all, like there have been reports of plenty of the people who were involved in the riots having a past history of abuse of women and in some cases paedophilia charges and stuff like that. So of course, and so like this crusade, and actually we should be having and maybe this should be the next episode, but we should be having a conversation about the epidemic of violence against women and girls, and that should be a conversation we're having because it is absolutely rampant. And but you're not showing up and protesting Andrew Tate. You're not showing up and like, you don't give a shit about that issue because you're not talking about that issue in any real terms.
I'd almost have more respect if you just came up and said, I hate black people, I hate brown people. At least we can just have a very clear conversation about why you hate those people, and don't try and conflate it with anything else. I'd have more respect if you just said, actually, I just hate black people.
But it's a little bit like how J.K. Rowling goes on this like whole tirade about how she's a crusader for women and girls, but she actually never ever talks about violence against women and girls. Whenever there is an issue in the media about violence against women, she is silent. So that tells you everything you need to know. She's obsessed with trans people, but she's never actually talking about violence against women and girls. I mean, I think that my sort of reflection on this issue is, the honest answer is I haven't decided how I've landed with it. I was really, I thought it was heartwarming and I was relieved at the response. And basically from that moment on, i.e. when all of the anti-racist protesters showed out in force, it essentially ended these riots, as far as I can tell. That was a sort of end point for them. And so that, I think, is a good reminder of the fact that there are more of us than there are of them. There are more people who believe that progress is a good thing and that racism is a bad thing than believe the opposite. And the people who believe the opposite are genuinely just a very loud minority. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this did happen in 2024. And we need to think deeply about why that happened and do more to address the root causes, which is racism that we refuse to talk about in the UK and the history of race in the UK and literacy on that topic. And also the fact that we are the most unequal society in Europe by quite a long stretch. And what are we doing about that? Because tensions are going to rise and keep rising, and the wrong people are going to be blamed for that if those root causes are not addressed.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think for me, it's about, we spoke about a little bit earlier about like ensuring that the conversation continues, right? And it's not just like, okay, we've moved on and the news cycle's changed. It's like, no, this was for me quite an important, it should be a very important inflection point. The positives, I think, of the BLM movement is I think as a society are able to have better conversations about these things, around these things. And I wonder if BLM hadn't happened, whether people would have come out in that same way. I think people are having more open conversations. They're more attuned to the experiences that other people have and have a better understanding of what this could look like if not checked. And I think that for me is heartwarming. The fact that I, from my experience, was able to almost be a bit ignorant during the time to protect myself and not feel like I have to go out like I did for BLM and be a part of the front line of kind of anti-racist protesting and be a part of that was heartwarming. And because I felt, taking a step back, I felt exhausted after BLM. And I just think that there are lots of positives. I think there are also some disappointments if I really look into the fact that people are still, and I don't think this is, it's really hard. I think a lot of it is to do with education. And it's very hard to blame people if they've not been educated, as far as I'm concerned. Like if you know what right and wrong is and you still decide to do the wrong thing, you can kind of be blamed for it. If you actually don't know any better, you don't have the capacity to know any better, it's a much bigger problem that's hard to, you can't really pin it on an individual. So I think for me, I come out of it feeling like, I'm similar to you, like I'm in this weird space with it where it's like, I need to see what happens next. And is it just a news cycle piece? Or are we going to see more riots, or are we going to see more discussions about making sure this doesn't happen again and the reasons why it's happened? I think we've got a better chance. I'm not saying we've got a high chance, a better chance to have a more rational conversation around it with this government than we did before. And I think it's a bit, at the moment, it's still early days, it feels a bit more stable and able to have create an environment where you can maybe have those conversations in a way that's a little bit more logical or pragmatic. So yeah, I don't know where I am with it, similar, but just kind of, I'm always going to be hopeful.
But hope is an action, not a feeling, I think. So hope is a thing that we can use to move forward, not just a sort of naive optimism.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Impolite Company.
If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our show and share it far and wide with anyone you think will benefit.
And if you'd like to connect with us directly, we're on LinkedIn as Kieran Scott Woodhouse and Ella McCann Tomlin.
We'll be back soon.